The chief guest of the inauguration of two-day international conference is Professor Serajul Choudhury. He is a former professor of Department of English who later became Professor Emeritus at the University of Dhaka. Professor Serajul Choudhury is also a literary critic, public intellectual, social and political analyst, activist, historian, educationist, editor, translator, and columnist. He has authored nearly 100 books and countless essays in Bangla and English. He had a versatile career as an educationist and political activist. He headed the department, became dean, led several academic and research projects, edited journals, initiated doctoral dissertation in English at the University of Dhaka, started periodicals, founded study centers, and remained involved in university politics. He founded the University Book Center in 1978 and the Center for Advanced Research in Humanities in 1986. In keeping with the spirit, he now runs a center called Samaj Rupantor Odhayon Kendro, Center for Social Transformation Studies, which works towards developing awareness of democracy in people to promote equality of rights and opportunities. He has been awarded with numerous prestigious awards, including Ekushe Podok, Bangla Academy Award, and others for his contribution in literature. On behalf of DH, it is an honor for me to welcome Professor Serajul Choudhury to give his inaugural speech. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Serajul.
Professor Rafiqul Islam, Professor Serajul, Professor Shamsud Murtaza, guests, colleagues and students. I call my piece Marx in History, and I might as well begin referring to the speech Engels made beside Marx's grave 3 days after his death. In his speech, Engels called Marx the greatest living thinker, which Marx certainly was. But for Engels and for the world also, Marx was above everything a revolutionist. We celebrate Marx for the radical change he had brought in man's outlook. Marx, according to Engels, made two revolutionary contributions. The first was that mankind must first of all eat, drink, and have shelter and clothing before it can produce politics, science, art, religion, etc. The second discovery was of surplus value, which explains how the capitalist appropriates value from the labor of the workers. Engels compared Marx's work in biological science, in historical science, to Darwin's in the field of natural science. Marx was scientific, but it needs to be pointed out that he was more than a scientist and that he was a philosopher. And a philosopher, according to Marx, is one who not only tries to explain the world, but to change it. And that is what Marx did all his life. And Marx was guided by the consideration that the toiling masses should be liberated from the shackles of private property. It would be useful to know Marx as a man to look at what he had written casually in his daughter's notebook, his daughter's Laura's notebook, and the answers are very significant. To the query, what he considered to be his principal virtue, the answer was simplicity. This is startling, for Marx was a deep thinker and a great scholar, but he was simple and clear in his attitude. He knew that what he was doing and what he ought to do, and did it wholeheartedly, passionately, with sympathy and anger, and there is nothing opaque, hesitant, or roundabout in his sayings. And his style was simple. He wrote both accurately and poetically. Asked what he thought was the greatest virtue of a man, he replied, moral strength. Marx spoke of strength and not of power. Power belonged to the state and the bourgeoisie. Moral strength was the principal resource of those who fought against the powerful. Laura wanted to know what he thought happiness was. The reply was fighting. And all his life, he was a fighter for the emancipation of man from the shackles of private ownership. For him, there was no respite. Marx could have been a university teacher, but he chose to be a journalist and a writer because he wanted to propagate his views to the people at large. The moral motto Marx liked most was questioning everything. He was a firm believer in his principles, but he questioned others and his own views as well. But he was not a sophist or a lawyer. We recall that he began his academic studies as a student of law and switched over to philosophy and wrote his PhD thesis on the difference between the Democritian and Epicurean philosophies of nature. For him, finding the difference is sine qua non for discovering the unity. What is particularly notable is Marx's reply to another question. He said everything human was dear to him, but he knew, and as you all know, due to his writings, that ever since the beginning of civilization, the human beings have been divided into antagonistic classes, and that the privileged have exploited the unprivileged. But it would be incomplete. It would be an incomplete picture of Marx as a man without referring to what Engels said at the end of his speech. I make bold to say, Engels said, that though he may have had many opponents, he had hardly one personal enemy. Marx was fascinated by the idea of progress in history. This was what Hegel taught him. To Hegel, history was neither repetitive nor cyclic. It moved continuously ahead through a dialectical process in which everything has its antithesis, and the contradiction between the two creates a synthesis, which itself is related by a new contradiction. History, therefore, has no end. But Hegel was an idealist. He thought that the contradiction was between ideas, and that an undefined spirit was responsible for the upward movement of history. These Marx found unacceptable. Feuerbach, who himself was deeply influenced by Hegel, proposed the contrary view that human thinking was determined by material conditions. Feuerbach's materialism, however, was mechanical. Marx brought the idealism of Hegel and the materialism of Feuerbach in an organic unity and founded a philosophical view which came to be known as historical materialism. Marx himself said, half jokingly, that he did not permit Hegelian dialectics to be on its head, and that he put it on its legs where it belongs. For Marx, history was not created by clash between ideas and civilizations, or by heroes and nobles and wars, but by material forces of production involving struggles between classes. The history, we remember the opening sentence of the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. That was a radical view. It helped man not only to change his idea of history, but also made, more importantly, him aware of his circumstances and inspired the oppressed to unite for overthrowing the capitalist system. In his idealism, Hegel had mystified the state and considered it a guarantor of freedom to the citizens. Marx took the contrary view, and he pointed out that the state was nothing but a committee to manage the affairs of the bourgeoisie. Unlike the anarchists who saw the state as an imposition from above, Marx had known that it arose from internal class contradictions and existed because of the irreconcilability of that struggle. It was therefore imperative for the elimination of the state to eliminate the contradiction. Thus, whereas for Hegel, class didn't exist, for Marx, class and class conflict are the abiding and moving force behind the advancement of history. However, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, Marx didn't emphasize the need of a political party for the proletariat. He thought a movement would do. But when, in the same year, there was an uprising of the working class in the capitals of most of the industrial countries, only to be quickly and ruthlessly suppressed by the state power, he realized that spontaneity was not enough and that an organized political party was essential. This became clearer to him During the stirring days of the Paris Commune of 1871, when the working class took over the control of the city but could not retain it for more than 70 days. The fall of Paris brought home to Marx the truth that the emancipation of the toiling masses could not be achieved without a political party. And without the smashing of the bourgeois state. Lenin developed the idea of the party further and put it into successful application through the setting up and operation of the Bolshevik Party. This was an example for all Marxists to follow. Lenin's contribution to Marxism lay in yet another direction. Originally, Marxism had pinned its hope on the industrial workers. The fall of Paris Commune proved that the industrial workers cannot achieve success without active collaboration of the peasantry. This was a lesson taken up by Lenin, who brought the peasantry within the fold of the revolution. This creative implementation of Marxism took a further extension when Mao Zedong showed that a socialist revolution could take place even in a country mainly of the peasants. Needless to say that Marxism would have remained a utopian philosophical idea without its creative application by a new generation of Marxists who belong to the less developed part of the world. But Marxism itself had in its core the creativity which was capable of extension and also of withstanding assaults from the capitalists as well as from those who wanted to revise it from within. Marx's coming was the fulfillment of a historical necessity. For centuries, people have thought and argued about the proper way of winning happiness. Plato, in his Republic, worked out the plan of an ideal state which the weakness of his vision lay in the acceptance of class distinctions as necessary. Thomas More took the opposite view and recommended abolition of the class division, but was unable to tell how that could be realized. Marx, who was a visionary and also a realist, showed the way. He was handling the capitalist system and knew its concealed method of exploitation and torture, and he propagated the idea that the inhuman system could be overthrown only by the united action of the working class who suffered under it. And he was also an activist and participated directly in the movements, working class movements of his time. Marx indicated that to set the individual free, it was necessary to abolish private property and establish social ownership in its place. The Bolshevik Revolution achieved this for the Russians in 1917. A new spirit was abroad. It went to Eastern Europe and spread itself to other areas, including China. And at one point of time, it was able to ensure happiness for 1/3 of the population of the world. But that system has now been dismantled. States fell one after another like 9 pins, and capitalism has returned with a vengeance. The legitimate question is, why did it happen? The explanation is available in Marxism itself. Paris Commune fell owing particularly to the savage assault by the bourgeoisie. The same happened in the case of Soviet Union. The revolution had occurred in one country only, and the entire capitalist world fell upon it like a pack trying to tear it into pieces, economically, politically, and ideologically. It didn't allow Soviet Union to devote itself to the promotion of collective happiness in the degree it wanted to. And working class movements everywhere were suppressed brutally. The massacre in Indonesia and Ceylon in the late 20th century are an example, if any be needed, of what the enmity of the capitalists was like. Secondly, there was within the Soviet system itself a silent and insidious formation of a bureaucratic class which wanted to perpetuate its power and was successful eventually. Mao Zedong had identified the danger and launched a cultural revolution to cleanse the state of its bureaucratic ailments. But there was hostility from within by the vested interests within his own party. Mao's attempt failed, and China has taken the road of capitalist development with consequential jingoistic proclivities. The third factor responsible for the breakdown of the socialist world was the wiles of capitalism. Capitalism is both ruthless and crafty. It confronted its enemy, the working class, both through repression and fraud. Capitalists offered concessions, bribed working class leaders, may introduce reforms, set up the so-called welfare state, arranged for the state to intervene as and when economic and financial crisis occurred. They used the mighty and growing power of the media to slander socialism and eulogize the achievements of capitalism. Capitalism has, moreover, the fact remains that it is much easier to be a pro-capitalist than a socialist, because the individual is born as a selfish being and acquires a social outlook only through praxis. It is also a fact that the idea of social ownership is difficult to accept and sustained. This is perhaps why, after the devastation caused by the First World War and the hope that emanated from the revolution of 1917, thinking people did not readily turn socialist. Some even became fascists. The liberals were there, and they admitted that capitalism had failed and that the poor needed succor, but were averse to social ownership in fear of becoming poor. The attitude is illustrated in the case of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. His heart, he said, bled at the sight of the misery caused by the system of land tenancy in Bengal, and yet he did not want the system to be abolished because it would ruin the material interests of his class. He was outspoken and said categorically that he and the likes of him do not approve of social revolution, nor do the liberals, for whom it is customary to conceal what they really feel. Just as the half-educated is worse than the illiterate, the liberals are worse than the reactionaries. The reactionaries are identifiable. The liberal works in come of age. Liberalism is a typically middle-class phenomenon. George Orwell, for example, began as a liberal, very soon turned a socialist, and recoiled to his original liberalism, having had the experience of what he calls Stalinist totalitarianism. In his bitterness, he wrote Animal Farm in 1984, showing the supposed dystopia of the rule of Stalin. Had he lived longer, he would have seen that he was dismally mistaken, that the totalitarianism of his abhorrence really was of a capitalist dispensation, and that today in the digital world of the present, humans are none the better in respect of freedom of thought and expression. As poets, T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats stood wide apart, but they went hand in hand as reactionaries. That left to himself the individuals in the working class is likely to be inclined more towards fascism than socialism, is illustrated by the fascinatingly disturbing case of D.H. Lawrence. Living in the ruined world of post-Second World War, W.H. Auden and Stephen Spender had moved initially towards communism, but they ended up differently. Auden went to America to become a citizen of that state. Spender agreed to edit a journal funded by the CIA. A pertinent question that remains to be answered is, why is it that India didn't become communist? The answer is not difficult to find. The Indian communists, despite their commitment and suffering, were unable to benefit creatively from the Marxist-Leninist teachings. 90% of the people in India were peasants. The communists should have taken care of that fact. They didn't. And owing to very real hindrances, they were not intellectually as well equipped as their revolutionary calling required them to be. Moreover, they were prone to depend on written texts and unwritten directives from Soviet Union. One of the most important factors helping the continuation of English colonial occupation and the returning of a social revolution was the failure of the Indians to resolve the national question. This failure hindered the bringing of the class question to the fore and helped the colonizers to divide the people on the communal line. The national question was a serious problem for Soviet Union too. In fact, it was much more complex than the Indian one. But Stalin's wisdom helped the resolution of the problem. He showed that language is the decisive factor in defining a nation. India had never been the land of a single nation. It was a subcontinent administered by the imperialists. It comprised many nations, each with its own language. This the communists in India were unable to see properly. The so-called national struggle between the Hindus and the Muslims led to the partitioning of India, harming class struggle and causing serious damage to the growing organizational strength of the Communist Party. The liberal response in India to the 1917 revolution was typically petty bourgeois. To take examples of what happened in Bengal, the post-1917 age was different from that of Rabindranath Tagore's. His presence was, of course, overwhelming, but it was not possible for the liberal humanist in him to internalize the spirit of the new age fully and to express it adequately. There were the modernist poets, 5 of them, who strove to go beyond Tagore in style and not in ideology, for they too were liberals. Buddhadev Bose, who was in the forefront, did not care for class and history, and for him, Marxism was a passing fact. Sudhindra Datta was, however, alive to the crisis within the capitalist world and knew about Marxism, but found it unacceptable because of what he called the difference between the ideology and its practice. Amiya Chakraborty believed in a quasi-mystical power of reconciliation of the hostilities. Vishnudev was prepared to be a Marxist, but was held back primarily by his love for English literature. It was Jibananda Das, the greatest of the 5, who felt deep in his heart the anguish caused by the operations of capitalism. But his suffering moved him tragically back to nature and an unhistorical past without class struggle. Incidentally, all 5 of these modernist poets had read English literature at the tertiary level and taught at colleges and universities. But there was another poet, singular, almost an outsider to the elitist group. He was Qazi Nazrul Islam, writing of the misery of his people and anticipating the revolution. Nazrul was poor, had never been to a college, had joined the British Army during the war, and heard about the revolution of 1917 only through censored report and seeped information. But he was more modern than the modernists in his anti-capitalist and pro-revolution stance. He edited news and newspapers, the first of which was Nobujuk, the New Age, and the second Dhumketu, the Comet. Then came Langol, the Plough, and finally Gonobani, the Voice of the People, indicating how fast he was moving ahead. He began as a believer in the Indian Congress, turned to the armed insurgents, and very quickly left them to become a socialist, calling in his publications Shadbuhara, the proletariat, and Shamobadi, the communist. He was duly imprisoned and went on a hunger strike for 39 days while in prison. 6 of his books were proscribed one after another. He sang, lectured, lent his hand in the foundation of the Communist Party. But Nazrul could not continue to develop in the line of his choice. He had a creative life of only 22 years. The pressures on him were too heavy, even for the genius in him to bear. He was harassed by the state, despised by the liberals, and haunted by poverty. He lost a child, a dear child, bore the pain of his wife's paralysis, and himself fell into a neurological sickness from which he never recovered. Nazrul's story tells us why the social revolution failed to happen. I come to the conclusion now. Capitalism has not put an end to history. On the contrary, it has come to the point, penultimate point, of its own end. And today, as never before, it stands naked in its shameless brutality. The wiles and the maneuvers of capitalism are both exposed and exhausted. It uses state power to suppress public opinion and to promote violence. It produces and trades in arms, drug and pornography, all of which are veritable instruments of death. It has become an enemy of nature, inciting nature to retaliate. Capitalism, which is incorrigibly patriarchal, has put women of all economic classes under sexual harassment. to an extent unknown in history. It is not the spectre of communism that haunts the world. It is the monster of capitalism which is devastating the planet. Tagore, writing his final testament in 1941, spoke of a crisis in civilization. Today, 67 years after his death, the world is facing a crisis, not of civilization, but of survival. Well-meaning scientists have given the world 12 years to mend its energy policies in order to survive. The crisis is felt everywhere. 99% are accusing the 1%, but the 99 do not belong to a single class, and it is the working class that must lead, forming its own party in every country. Capitalism has become universal and has penetrated deep into human consciousness. To overthrow it, therefore, it will be necessary for the movement to be international in character and sustained and uncompromising in its operation. History has progressed, but underneath it, the class relationship has remained the same. It is that relationship which must be changed to save mankind from extinction. A social revolution will unfetter the productive forces, make the world a place of abundance and happiness, unencumbered by anxiety and enmity. That is the vision, the Marxist vision of history, and that will certainly be realized, for human beings are no longer prepared to surrender to the oppression of the many by the few. Revolutions have happened in the past. A new revolution is waiting at the crossroad of history. The brinkmanship of the mischief mongers will not prevail. Thank you.